Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be representing the foreign president of Japan, the host of this seminar. I'm President Kodama. We are now going to begin the fiscal year 2023 second international FPCJ webinar. Let me introduce myself. For 44 years, I was a diplomat, and in 2020, November, I was appointed president of FPCJ. In terms of relationship with the Chinese government, when I was deputy ambassador to the United Nations in 2012, September 27th, at Anga, Senkaku Islands territories, Minister Yang made a speech to exercise the rights, and that was an unforgettable memory. Currently, I am a visiting professor at Hiroshima University School of Law, and I offer classes on foreign policy. At today's webinar, we have the media representatives of Japan and other countries, and people of all walks of life, members of the diplomatic corps in Japan, university students, and high school students. From afar, we have participants joining us from Boston, Ottawa, Paris, Hanoi, Timor-Leste, and Hong Kong. So I take this opportunity to extend my deepest gratitude to all of you who have signed up, and I'm thankful for the general support offered to us by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. A very important announcement. This webinar will be brought about through simultaneous interpretation between Japanese and English. You will find the interpretation at the bottom of the screen, so please select the language of your preference. The theme today is Security in East Asia. How is foreign media reporting on the situation in Taiwan and Japan? Last month, on the 13th, the presidential election took place in Taiwan, and the whole world was paying attention to the results, because the results would impact the cross-strait relationship between Taiwan and mainland China, and also the issue regarding the unification between Taiwan and China. That's why people were interested. And based upon such context, today, we are going to take up how international media is reporting the Taiwan issue and discuss the status quo. And upon that basis, we will discuss what should concerned parties, China, Taiwan, US, and Japan do to avoid conflict in Taiwan. Let me introduce to you the panelists. I will be serving as the moderator. First of all, from the Japanese side, we have two panelists. First of all, Mr. Kato Yoichi, Special Fellow, Waseda University Institute of Asia-Pacific Studies. For 2 years, he was with the political section of Asahi newspapers, but more recently, he was with the Institute for National Defense and Security Research at the Ministry of National Defense of Taiwan for 2 years from 2021. Last year, on March 31st, at the Japan Press Club, he delivered a speech titled Taiwan Contingency and the Choice of Japan, Security Consumer to Security Provider. The second Japanese panelist is Professor Sahashi Ryo, Associate Professor of International Politics, Institute for Advanced Studies of Asia, University of Tokyo. He spoke at our press briefing at our center last year in June 26th on the security policies. And Professor Sahashi was featured in the monthly magazine Sekai last year as an expert on Taiwan issues, and his article that was contributed to the Sekai magazine last year attracted much attention. And from the foreign media, we have three panelists. Mr. Noah Snyder, Tokyo Bureau Chief, The Economist. In The Economist of December 11th, 2021, he issued the Special Reports Japan in that Economist edition. And in relation to today's webinar, he talked about the escalation of tension in the geopolitical dimension of East Asia, and he mentioned that Japan lies the front-line state, which is still vivid in our memories. Next, we have Ms. Yan Min-chu, Tokyo Bureau Chief, Central News Agency, Taiwan. It's the oldest news bureau in Taiwan and was established in 1924. And Ms. Yang has been serving as the Tokyo Bureau Chief more than a decade, since 2011, covering Japan-Taiwan relationship or covering Japan. Last but not least, we have one more from overseas, Ms. Catherine Hill, Greater China correspondent of the Financial Times based in Taipei. Before that, she was the bureau chief of Moscow of Financial Times. In short, she is the person that needs to be there in Taiwan. She is one of the best-known journalists covering Taiwan. By the way, the comments the panelists will be making during the course of this webinar will be purely within their personal capacity, so their comments will not reflect in any way the thinking of the institutes that they are affiliated with. Let me briefly introduce to you the program. First session will take place for 50 minutes on the position of concerned parties regarding Taiwan issue and media reporting. And the second session will be 40 minutes, what should concerned parties do to avoid armed conflict in Taiwan. There will be followed by Q&A. And in order to be efficient in the Q&A, I ask you a favor. Please prepare your questions. We're already accepting your questions. For you to type in your questions in the Q&A box of the personal computers. The questions can be submitted either in Japanese or English. And we'd appreciate if you could identify your name, affiliation, and to whom you are asking the question. We will finish this event by 5 o'clock. We will begin session 1. But let me make an initial comment on Taiwan as basic facts.
So the major concerned parties, U.S., China, and Taiwan and Japan. I'd like to briefly explain the position of those concerned parties, and after that, I'd like to ask the panelists to make a comment. As for the position of Japan, first of all, a very important epoch events happened as follows. First is based on the Potsdam Declaration in August 1945, and Japan renounced the territorial rights and signed the peace treaty, and between China and Taiwan, the diplomatic relations were covered. And in September 29, 1972, Japan-China joint communique normalized the diplomatic relations with China, and as a result of that, Japan had cut off the diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and now Japan has maintained the non-governmental practical relationship with Taiwan. Now, the important points of Japan-China joint communique, there are 2 points. First is that People's Republic of China has been approved as the only legitimate government of China. And the second point is that we fully understand, respect PRC's position, arguing that Taiwan is an indivisible part of PRC based on Article 8 of the Potsdam Declaration. What that means is that with regards to the territorial right of Taiwan, Japan is not in the position to make an official comment. That has been made clear. And as part of the Japanese government to date, Japan hopes that the Taiwan issue will be peacefully resolved through a direct dialogue between the concerned parties. As for China's position, if I may also explain briefly, Taiwan is an indivisible part of China. Secondly, they would like to achieve the full unification of the homeland. Third, they will make an utmost effort to get the outlook for the peaceful unification and never promise to renounce the use of force. In other words, which means that they're not denying the possibility of the armed conflict in Taiwan. Now, the stance of Taiwan, I think it will be covered later on by the panelists, but for the unification issue, the Democratic Progressive Party, the Leading Party, are saying 2 points. The sovereignty of Taiwan is in the Republic of China, and the sovereignty of the mainland China lies in the PRC. The second point is that the Republic of China is a de facto independent state, which requires no declaration of independence. In the presidential election last month, how to interpret the results of that will be discussed by the panelists later on. Now, two more points, if I may. The reversal of the position of China and Taiwan in the international community. So in October 1945, when United Nations kicked off, the Republic of China became one of the permanent member as one of the countries who won over the Japan. And once PRC was established in 1949, PRC challenged that. And in November 1971, UN General Assembly resolution was made approving the representation of PRC. So Taiwan left the UN. However, as a matter of fact, as of today, as of February 2024, Taiwan has diplomatic relations with 12 UN members. That is also a fact. Now, the stance of United States, last but not least. So in 1954, mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Republic of China was signed. So accepting the obligation to defend Taiwan. And then in 1972, the diplomatic relationship with China was signed, proving that China is the only legitimate government. On the other hand, one China, one policy is not to be promoted. That has been made clear. So the U.S. has made it clear that they will not support the independence of China, but Taiwan. But one important thing is that there is one China, and Taiwan being part of China. For that Chinese argument, U.S. is acknowledging that China is arguing that, but it doesn't mean that the U.S. is recognizing the position of the Chinese government. That's another important point. And in 1980, the diplomatic relationship between two countries were established. So Taiwan was cut off. But actually, 1 year before that, the U.S. Parliament actually enacted the Taiwan Relations Act. Any to decide the future of Taiwan in a non-peaceful means will be a threat for security in the West Pacific region and very important event for U.S. That has been made clear that supply of weapons on the defense nature is to be provided to Taiwan, which has been continued. So the stance of the U.S. is that U.S. is maintaining a rather strategic ambiguity, not to clarify what kind of responses that they would make when China uses force to invade Taiwan. So that has been the case to date. So sorry for the lengthy introduction, but that's just the basic background for you to have a discussion. So without further ado, I'd like to start the discussion among the panelists. First of all, from Taiwan Central News Agency, Ms. Yang Min-chu, 5 minutes each, if you can make a comment. So Ms. Yang, please.
The presidential election attracted much attention because the reason is because it reflects the cross-strait relationship. Always, presidential elections form the cross-strait relationship and Taiwan's relationship with the United States. This time around, China, in various ways, tried to obstruct the elections, obstruct from the Taiwan perspective, for example, using money to invite mayors of rural cities for tourism in mainland China, or fake news spreading, or military intimidation, escalation of intimidation. They tried many attempts, but in the end, Lai Chien-to of the DPP, the current ruling party, was elected. The modus operandi of China from many Taiwan people would appear that they're doing that because it's not a democratic party. They don't understand elections taking place in democratic states. They try to cause chaos, but it's ineffective. It's counterproductive. But in the end, William Lai, premier, when he was premier, he said he's pragmatic worker for Taiwan's independence. He described himself as pragmatic worker for Taiwan's independence. So China thought that Taiwan would be seeking independence going forward. And in order to prevent that from happening, actual combating, but it didn't go to actual combat, but many fighters flew over to close by. U.S. is supporting Lai Chien-te, and many prominent congressional members visited Taiwan, most recently from the United States. Japan has not yet sent high-profile dignitaries to Taiwan, but Japan attaches importance on Taiwan. More than the political dimension, for economic security of Japan, Taiwan is important. For example, TSMC Kumamoto plant was inaugurated, and in the inauguration ceremony, video message was sent by the Prime Minister, and he said that for Japan's economic security, the Kumamoto plant opening is very important. Taiwan is an important partner of Japan. So on the economic front, and not just economic security, but military and diplomatic security from such dimension, Japan should tell China that they can never try to change the status quo. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So there was an election intervention by China, but the difference in the system or structure, there may not be a sufficient understanding. So moving on to the next panelist from Taiwan, if I may invite Ms. Kathleen Hill from Financial Times to make a comment. So over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you very much. Also, thank you, Kodama-san, for outlining the basic positions on Taiwan on all sides, so allowing us to maybe focus a little bit more on the positions and things that are driving things right now. Currently, over the last few years, what has made reporting on Taiwan challenging has been that we are in a three-way situation here with Taiwan, China, and the US, where each of the three sides see the drivers for tensions very differently. So I'm going to try and put this in not too complicated terms. So Taiwan basically blames China for raising tension by stepping up its pressure campaign on Taiwan. So that's had some diplomatic or foreign policy components. That's also had some components of economic coercion, but the main and the most visible component has been military. That contrasts with the perception on the Chinese side, because China actually blames both Taiwan and the US for the increase in tensions, and China at least publicly argues that these two other sides have been making moves that are changing the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. So and you can see that reflected in China's rhetoric. When we look back to the first time the Democratic Progressive Party was in power in Taiwan, there was also tension across the strait, but at that time, China was mainly blaming Taiwan only, whereas now we have frequent mention by Beijing of so-called foreign interference, and it's very clear that they're referring to the US. So the Chinese Communist Party accuses the US more and more openly of hollowing out its one China policy. We're now even at the point where the leader Xi Jinping is suggesting that if the US is really serious about one China, it should be supporting peaceful unification, which of course is so far not directly part of the US stated position. Now, that is I've outlined how Taiwan sees the current situation, how China sees the current situation. I think it's even more challenging to characterize how Washington sees it. Clearly, from my observation, the main driver behind how the US sees the Taiwan situation has been actually that this whole problem is a function of changing US-China relations. So we've clearly seen over the past several years a disillusionment process in Washington with what kind of a global actor China would be. So that has also driven how US politicians deal with China, and as a function of that, with Taiwan. So we've seen increasing bipartisan consensus for support for Taiwan on all fronts, and some of the hawks in Washington have also taken to, well, trying to use Taiwan to make a point about China and to express their hawkish position. So this entire environment of changing relationships and rising tensions has made it very difficult for a journalist to report on this situation, because we have a sharply rising interest globally in the Taiwan issue. And with that comes a drastic increase in the number of reports and commentary and analysis, but also including a lot of people who didn't used to pay attention to this and who have not really had any previous background in researching any component of the topic. So we're dealing with a situation where there's a lot being said and written about a very, very complex issue, and some of that content or that commentary is not very informed, and sometimes even contains some misinformation. Some of it is very emotional, and as journalists, that makes our work quite difficult. So from my perspective, what I try to focus on a lot is read as much as I can and about how different actors in China view the Taiwan issue, and what China is trying to find out what China is actually doing on Taiwan policy. That's also getting more challenging because China is getting more closed, and these things are not often, the leadership's thoughts are not often discussed in public. I'll leave it there.
樋口さんありがとうございました。で本当に実はこの後ぜひ
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Hill. So we'd like to deepen the discussion later on that U.S., China, and Taiwan, a three-way mutual distrust, so to speak, the mutual dismay, so to speak, has been deepened. I think your point is so important on that. And that itself, per se, has been driving the heightened tension for the past few years. So why has that happened? We would like to have a deeper discussion later on. And your second point, what we should be careful as journalists in reporting, your point is also very important. You made a very important point that China, what they're trying to do, we have to accurately read out, understand, is what you said. Point that is indeed. But that's another point I'd like to have a bit later on. So the panelist, Mr. Schneider.
Thank you very much, for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. You know, I was thinking as you were giving your very useful introduction of conversations I was having about 5 years ago when I was preparing to move to Japan, to cover Japan from Moscow, where actually Catherine and I were based at the same time. And at that time, conversations around Taiwan here in Japan were the kind of conversations you had quietly in the corner of a bar. They were whispered conversations. They were issues that of course policymakers and analysts were thinking about, but that were not discussed in public in the way that we're doing here. And I think it's really been striking in the past 4 or 5 years or so to see, this discussion emerge in Japan from a under the surface discussion to a very public one, to a topic, Taiwan contingencies being discussed in books, in articles, on TV programs. And I think that emergence of the Taiwan contingency or the Taiwan issue here in the Japanese discourse is certainly mirrored in the global discourse and in global media coverage. And it's, of course, as my colleagues rightly noted, it's a very difficult and tricky situation to cover as journalists, in part because of the number of perspectives and the number of players involved, and in part because of the difficulty of covering those particular players. I think what we've been trying to do at The Economist is several things. One is to build up our understanding of China. This has been a long-running process. Sometimes it's come, unfortunately, for those of us here in Tokyo, at the expense of other locations in Asia. But building up a China team, building up a deep understanding and networks that allow us to continue reporting on China and to do so across different platforms. We now have a China podcast, a China newsletter, in addition to a China section in the weekly paper. But at the same time, it has also meant building up an understanding of Taiwan itself as a distinct actor. So I think our coverage of the recent elections is indicative of this. We now have correspondents based in Taipei. We had a Taiwanese election poll tracker going throughout the election season. So we're trying to cover Taiwanese politics and Taiwanese society in the same way as we do Chinese and American politics and society. I think the other challenge that I would add for us in the media to be aware of, it's something I think we all think about and struggle with, is how to convey the urgency of this issue. And of course it is one of, if not the most urgent, certainly regional and possibly global flashpoints. But how to convey that urgency without fueling a sense of hysteria, how to cover this issue without feeding into the worst instincts of those involved, without creating an atmosphere that ends up becoming a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of tension and conflict. So I think that's a really big challenge for us and something to keep in mind. For myself personally, being based here in Tokyo and primarily covering Japan, I think a lot about how to explain Japan's role in this dynamic to readers outside of the region, and how to shed light on the areas in which Japan's interests converge, certainly with its ally America's, but also the areas where its interests diverge. And I think Japan's interests are certainly not identical to America's interests. Japan's role in this and Japan's potential response to any tension or contingency around Taiwan is by no means a given. It's by no means an automatic that Japan will necessarily follow America directly. And so I think trying to make sure that we don't feed into a gap in expectations, which I fear sometimes is opening up between readers outside of Japan, particularly sort of conversations I have with folks in America, in the wake of Japan's security reforms in recent years, that conflate perhaps changes to Japan's security policies with a change in Japan's stance vis-a-vis Taiwan. So I think those are all quite complex issues, and we can get into them in more detail. I will stop here. Thank you.
野さんありがとうございました。確かに
Thank you, Noah. True, it's a very complex issue, but let me try to repeat the 3 points that I thought was important. First of all, as on the side of the reporting side, you don't want to agitate hysteria, but at the same time, the urgency of the situation must be communicated well. And second point, of course, this is not just a U.S.-China issue, that this is a Taiwan issue, and that Taiwan's vantage point, its own vantage point, must be communicated. So the significance of Taiwan is elevating. And lastly, Japan's issue. So if I may quote your final words, Japan's response to contingency may not be automatic, may not be given, and the response of Japan and the response of the United States may not be identical. And I think that is a very significant point. I'm sure that there would be more conversations on that. Mr. Kato.
はい、それでは私から説。
So if I may make a comment on the stance of Japan and how the Japanese media is reporting, so those are the points that I'd like to cover. As for the stance of Japan, the government, so President Kodama already explained that. So basically, vis-a-vis the relationship with Taiwan, it's a non-political, practical relationship. But in 2021, Japan has sent out an important message in a joint statement of a U.S.-Japan summit meeting. I think you may remember this, but the importance of peace and stability of the Taiwan Strait is to be emphasized. And so that's very important because that message, of course, has been shared in Europe and other opportunities in many times, in repeated times. And for Japan to have sent such a message is quite critical, and that's worth being assessed. However, having said that, what happens if China breaks that? On that point, Japan has not done sufficiently. For instance, in August 2022, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of House, visited Taiwan, and after that, China has made a large-scale military exercise. And after that, the airplane was flying over the midline of the Taiwan Strait. So the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait, I believe, has been destroyed already. But the fact that it has been destroyed, how is Japan responding to that? Well, nothing sufficient has been done. The Chief Secretary only made a comment in his press conference, and that's not sufficient at all. Not that yet. When it comes to the Taiwan issue, there has been an active discussion. For instance, if Taiwan is lost, what's going to happen to Japan? Such question was made. And Japan decided to introduce this Tomahawk missile, the counterattack capacity. Would that be used as a deterrence for the Taiwan contingency? Such question was made, but the government has not made any clear answers to those questions. But rather, so government has been very cautious. Now, among the Diet members, there have been some aggressive comments. For instance, in December 2021, former Prime Minister Abe attended a symposium held by a think tank in Taiwan, said that Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency. And Mr. Aso, in August 2023, visited Taiwan, and he said that to defend Taiwan, for the peace and stability of Taiwan, it will be a deterrence to clearly communicate to the other counterparty to use the defense capability for the stability of Taiwan Strait. And also the private think tanks in Japan, assuming the Taiwan contingency, there is an active discussion on the simulations of how Japan will respond, and the desktop exercises, and many books have been published on that. But what we have to be careful here is that Japan is not going to defend Taiwan. So Mr. Aso's comment and Mr. Abe's comment and the comment made at the summit meeting, if we take them as this, then in the case of a Taiwan contingency, it seems as if Japan is going to also be involved in the conflict. But in looking at the public poll of Taiwan, a lot of people in Taiwan expect Japan to come and help. Some studies show that there is high expectation to Japan rather than to U.S. So that's a wrong expectations that is shared by the Taiwanese people. So Japan is not saying that we would defend Taiwan. If we can make that clear, that's correct. But as a matter of fact, for Taiwanese people to have such wrong expectation, that is the responsibility of Japan, that Japan has been making a mistake in sending the wrong messages. So that's a point that I'd like to issue as an issue. And how press is reporting in Japan. So there is a huge number of reports by the Japanese media. When we do a search with keyword in Asahi newspaper, with the search of Taiwan contingency, 680,000, Yomiuri 310,000, and Nikkei 1.82 million. And with Amazon.com, when we search the Japanese books on Taiwan contingency, 1.5 million. So many that it's very difficult to conduct a qualitative analysis, and how it's taken up in YouTube. In a nutshell, what happens if Japan is involved in a Taiwan contingency? Such concern. There are many reports from that perspective. That is all from me for now.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Mr. Kato. So we heard from 4 panelists so far. They shared their perspectives. Now, the expert, Professor Sahashi, over to you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. I'm the only researcher participating in this event. I am Sahashi of University of Tokyo. As all panelists have referred to, reporting on Taiwan has increased globally and in Japan. When I talk with my colleagues covering Taiwan, the presidential election was covered by historical high number of researchers, Japanese researchers as well, and I think that's a fact. I currently reside in Seoul, but probably in terms of the number of journalists, there are more journalists covering Taiwan in Seoul. Of course, population is double, so that may be natural. But explosively, the number of reports covering Taiwan has exploded. But my point is, knowing what the Taiwan people are thinking, are all of those reports leading to us better understanding how the people are thinking? Because the issues highlighted were cross-straits and Taiwan, U.S. Those aren't the only pending issues. And like all other elections, domestic issues within Taiwan were very important pending issues that did influence the results of the elections. And unless those points are covered well, we should be skeptical of the quality of the reporting and also the people on the streets. Taiwan is the factor that is determining the Sino-U.S. relationship. Maybe people think so, but that's not a fact. Taiwan is used as the subject, and the sentence is constructed in a way that leads to some misunderstanding over the relationship or the influence caused by Taiwan, and that's my concern. And China may take advantage of that in its propaganda, mainland China. China may send a message that it's Taiwan that's trying to agitate such fear. So that's my point with regards to coverage on Taiwan. Coming to my second point, Ms. Catherine Hill mentioned that we have to interpret well the intentions behind China. That's very true. If I may add, we have to interpret well the true intent of the United States. That's necessary. But do we have enough reports asserting those points? I don't think so, because the reports are on Biden's miswording, and they make that headlines. But I not really read so many reports that does full analysis. If you look into the White House and talk with people within the White House, Taiwan issue cannot influence a Sino-U.S. relationship because Sino-U.S. relationship has to be based on the assumption that it will be a long-term competitive relationship. That's really taken for granted in academia, but are we able to communicate that to the general public? It becomes so direct that Taiwan contingency equals U.S.-China conflict. Maybe many people think too simplistically about that. And deterrence is what the U.S. is thinking. And that's the subject of the second session. And it's U.S. intention is not war, fighting war. It's deterrence. But I don't think there has been enough reporting on the true intention behind the U.S. actions. So Ms. Hill said we have to read the intent of U.S., China, and Taiwan. And I think we should do more analysis deeply and report the deep analysis of each of those parties. And now back to Japan. As Mr. Kato has said, in recent years, there has been heightened interest towards Taiwan. And Admiral Davidson, 2021, March, made a comment of the Indo-Pacific Command. And then February 22, Ukraine, aggression of Russia to Ukraine. And that changed the general public's view, and more so in the political world. I interviewed 20-30 politicians in Japan. Why there was this major turnaround of Kishida's security policy? I asked them that question. And Davidson's comment triggered the Taiwan issue and concern, and that's a fact. I'm just one analyst of many, and I would like to say don't forget North Korea, but it's also a fact that Taiwan did change the structure of Japan's security policy, which is an interesting point. Having said so, however, the next point is my final point. Reporting in Japan, thereafter, what happened? Simulation 2 years ago. Speaker Pelosi's visit. These were tangible, easy to make headline type of issues like simulation. Japanese reporting concentrated only on those points. Simulation is being done, but that doesn't mean that there's heightened probability of conflict erupting at this very moment. Simulation is just to be ready if and when contingency occurs. And it's about training of the participating politicians and relevant parties. And people forget that. So simulation is based upon this kind of scenario. Oh, they're doing this simulation again. And that does have visual power to persuade the people and is giving the impression that the probability of conflict or contingency is going up. And then in the end, what happens, and I will finish shortly, but there are other scenarios than the assumed scenario in the simulation, economic blockade or diplomatic coercion by China to other countries. And these are all skipped and only the headlines on simulation. I think that's a problem. We should have a wider view if we are to report correctly Taiwan issue. Thank you very much. All of those issues were very important points. And of course, we are under time constraints, but and it's not going to be possible to cover all of the points, but let me try to summarize.
からまずやはり
So, as for the results of the presidential election, Ms. Yan or Ms. Hill, if I can, you can make another comment because Taiwan's stance, for instance, as Noah-san said earlier, the media should report on the stance of Taiwan more clearly and accurately. And Ms. Yan, for Taiwan is exercising democracy. She focused on that, and the result shows that President Lai was elected, and there's going to be an inauguration in May. But for the unification issue, how is he going to deal with that? Is drawing a lot of attention. So on that point, what is your view? Any additional comment?
May 20th, Lai will be inaugurated, and he will be making an inauguration speech, and there's focus on that. What is going to say? But generally speaking, the incumbent, Tsai Ing-wen's policy will be taken over by Lai. In other words, not unification policy, but sustaining status quo. But sustaining status quo has changed gradually. As Mr. Kato mentioned, both Japan and the United States are calling for the peace and stability of the Taiwan Straits. But all of those comments are too abstract. We don't really understand what they are saying. How will U.S. come to help? How will Japan come to help? For example, there was this poll taken, questionnaire, and Japanese self-defense force will arrive in Taiwan before the U.S. forces come to Taiwan. Many respondents answered so, which is outrageous. Wrong perception. And Japanese media people are laughing. But for the Taiwan citizens, Japan is the closest friendly country. So we hope that Japan will come to help. 2 years ago, at the time of the pandemic, when Taiwan faced shortage of vaccines, Japan was the first country to offer 420 doses of vaccines. So it was a rain of blessing. Taiwan has this endless, infinite expectations towards Japan, always on all things. And for example, you talk about the Taiwan contingency, and the Tsai administration, and by the way, Lai also said so, but if possible, we want to have a security dialogue, high-level security dialogue with Japan. We want to establish such a mechanism with Japan. They said that, but Japan, we don't see such signs of that happening in Japan. And Taiwan people don't really understand the Japanese legal system. Taiwan contingency, is that an important, significant existential threat? Or is it use of force, violence? The Taiwan citizens don't understand the nuances of those legal words, so we don't really understand whether or not or how Japan will come to help. So I think Japan should use simpler words to explain to the global audience.
Thank you. Ms. Hill, do you have any comment on Taiwanese domestic or towards May, or how new President Lai will respond? If you have any additional comment, please.
Yes, sure. So when you ask what is Taiwan's stance, there are several problems with that, right? So Lai Ching-te has been characterized, or has been mainly perceived internationally through his comments characterizing himself as a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. That was when he was premier. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that nobody outside Taiwan understands the changed nature or contents of what Taiwan independence means in the domestic context. So that was when back in the day of the Kuomintang one-party dictatorship. This was a movement of Taiwanese against what they perceived as an external power having come in and forced Chinese nationalism upon them at a time when they actually there were some expectations that Taiwan could gain autonomy or even independence after Japan left. So Taiwan independence historically has been a movement against the Republic of China, against the Kuomintang regime. Then ever since democratization, ever since the DPP first came to power, Taiwan independence has meant something quite different. And the DPP adopted in 1999 to make itself palatable to a mainstream voters in Taiwan, it adopted a resolution for the future of Taiwan, saying basically we're independent already, so there's no need to declare independence, which is exactly the position that Tsai Ing-wen has been taking, and that Lai Ching-te has pledged to adhere to. And then there are variations of this. But so that is not enough for China, very clearly. China has insisted that a DPP president must publicly express their adherence to the 1992 consensus, which is one form of one China. So that's what the PRC wants from the DPP, and they're not going to get that. For Lai Ching-te, he cannot do that. And he will not do that. So, and if we look back to Tsai Ing-wen's first inauguration in 2016, we can also see that she tried to get around that. She tried to give China some phrasing that was kind of close, but not quite there, and that was not enough. So, against that backdrop, I think whatever Lai Ching-te says during his inaugural address can only make so much difference. I mean, it can go badly wrong in that he might use some kind of phrasing that is perceived as provocative or whatever by China, but I don't think that there is any chance that he will say something that can break the impasse.
ありがとうございました。それじゃあ次にですね。
Thank you. Having listened to the debate, I would like to present one issue for you to comment on. And this was mentioned by Ms. Hill and Professor Sahashi. U.S.-China relations have changed drastically in the past couple of years. What are the reasons? Xi administration receded from open up policy and reform policy, and the nation's security depends on economic growth. And that was a major turnaround of the policy of the Xi administration, and that became the trigger. And that triggered the bipartisan disillusion of the United States. And that has become one of the triggers of the big change or exacerbation. And also within the democracy in Taiwan becoming more robust, there is the discuss that there should not be exercising of force. But I don't think we need to engage in a brain gaming for the sake of brain gaming. But once again, can we review the changes that have occurred in the most recent years and what the reasons are? It may be difficult to pinpoint the factors, but Mr. Snyder, what do you think?
Well, I think there's plenty of blame to go around. There's certainly moves that have been made and forces at work on each of the many sides of this issue. I think clearly the changes that have occurred inside China under Xi Jinping and the more aggressive stance that China has taken, not only vis-a-vis Taiwan, but in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, is a big driver. But I think of the tensions, I should say, with America. But I think, to be fair, there are clearly domestic processes happening inside American society and American politics that have played into that dynamic as well. This, was expressed most sort of radically in the Trump administration and in the trade war that they launched. But being tough on China has become a bipartisan consensus in America. We've seen the Biden administration in many respects maintain, if not strengthen, some of the trade and technology policies that the Trump administration began. So I think a more confrontational attitude and a sense that China has become a domestic political issue in American politics has taken root. It's no longer just a foreign policy issue. It is a domestic political issue. And once foreign policy issues become domestic political issues, it becomes much harder to deal with them in a cool-headed and nuanced way.
佐橋先生いかがでしょうか。
How about you, Professor Sahashi?
いや最近中国の専門家の
So with the Chinese experts, I had a discussion recently. And of course, there is a mutual distrust, as was pointed out. There is a deep root of mutual distrust. But one of the drivers for that is with the President Xi Jinping focusing on the domestic security. Maybe that has been one of the triggers. I think that is leading to the response from the international committee. What is your view on that point?
はい、ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. That's very correct. Chinese side changed first. From the opening up and reform policy, U.S. arbitrarily thought that that would continue. But against that expectation, Xi administration came to power and they became more authoritarian. And U.S. distrust strengthened, and that elevated tension. So up to that point, I can accept that theory. But I intentionally want to add two factors. It's not just mutual distrust. First of all, from the U.S. perspective, this is also a conflict over power, tension over power. And if it's a conflict over power, U.S. is cautious towards strong growth of China, and it was post-2013. Number of patents, number of citations, papers, U.S. became cautious. So distrust is important, but power is also important. So ideologically, I don't think the ideology issue is that strong. So I think it's mistrust and power. On the other hand, what about the Chinese side? From the Chinese perspective, they realize that U.S. isn't going to change just because administration changes. And also for Taiwan, U.S. says, and they also truly intent is to impose deterrence. But from the Chinese perspective, China thinks U.S. has changed. So China legitimately has distrust over U.S. So the root is very deep. Thank you very much. Anyone who would like to add comments? Mr. Kato.
So looking at U.S.-China relationship, basically, what's happening right now is that so far, when it comes to U.S. and Japan and Western countries in Europe, universal values and rule-based orders. With that, they've been trying to have a discipline when it comes to relationship with China. And the background is that what we say is right. We are at the moral high ground. So that was the idea. But that doesn't come true any longer. So that's what's happening right now. Such universal values and rule-based orders. So those ideas will actually sway the political base in China. So China will never tolerate or accept that. So who is right? So this international order that is now changing, to face the international order that is changing and to respond to that, that is no longer valid, especially responding to global South countries. But China type of autonomy is one of the options. It's not a matter of whether it's wrong or it's inferior. So U.S., Japan, European countries should acknowledge that as a fact. So legacy order and alternative orders can exist at the same time in the international order. And within that framework, we should think of Taiwan issue as well. Thank you for a very interesting point.
この点についてもし手短で
So Ms. Hill, do you have any comment on that point? On the relationship between China and U.S., what's happening now? Do you have any comment, Ms. Hill?
I think this year is, of course, crucial because we are now looking at the U.S. Presidential election, and there are already a lot of people quite worried, not only here in Taiwan, but I gather also in other countries around the region, what will happen if Donald Trump wins another term, because that would add unpredictability to an already very unstable situation. So I agree that well, the disconnect between the US's traditional high ground and apparent shared values and adherence to a rules-based order on the one hand, and then the US's internal problems undermining the attractiveness and the credibility of these things on the other hand, now that's become a problem. And that's weighing on the US-China relationship, and it's weighing on the Taiwan issue as well.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. So before we move on to the next session, just one last point. A question to Mr. Snyder, actually. Well, Mr. Kato earlier mentioned that in Japan, what happens if Japan is involved in the Taiwan contingency? There are some concerns among the Japanese public, but then the government does not respond clearly to hypothetical questions. Now, among the think tanks, there is an active discussion saying that Taiwan, the contingency is deemed as a Japan contingency, and there are many simulations that are happening. So this reality in Japan, how do you view that as a journalist from economist or compared to what's happening in US or Europe? Is it unique to Japan, or are we okay with this? Or from a non-Japanese journalist, if you can make a comment on this.
Well, I think the reality is that no government knows exactly how they would respond if contingency did happen. Neither the Japanese nor the American nor probably the Chinese or Taiwanese. It could play out in so many different ways and would be so dependent on the context and would probably, as we've seen with Russia's war in Ukraine, would not go according to anyone's plan. So I think the reality is that there is a great deal of ambiguity on all sides, some of it strategic and some of it unintentional. But I think it's striking talking to Japanese officials and trying to ask this question. And I think what I've found is that there are stages or layers to Japanese involvement. There is a first stage that people are more or less happy to answer directly about, which is, will Japan allow America to use its bases in Japan as a launching point for the defense of Taiwan? It seems fairly clear to me that, at least within Japanese official circles, the answer to that question is yes, because if they answered no, the alliance with America would break. Then the next question becomes, would Japan itself get involved? And here you get into the legal distinctions, which we discussed earlier. Is this which of the legal distinctions does the situation meet? And I think the reality is that it's a political decision. If you want it to be an existential threat to Japan, politicians can make that case to the public and make that distinction in the Diet. If they want it not to be, if they want to have a legal reason not to act, one can also paint a picture that leaves it short of that existential distinction. So I think the unique piece of the Japanese situation is the bureaucratic or sort of legalistic nature of the decision-making process, which in other countries may be happening in a slightly more direct way.
Professor Tajin, anything to add? If not, thank you. Thank you very much. We go to session 2.
またよろしくお願いします。
So the second session, based on the discussion that we held in the session 1, if I may blunt and direct, So to avoid the contingency in Taiwan, what should the concerned parties, China, Taiwan, U.S., and Japan, what should the concerned parties do to avoid the conflict or contingency in Taiwan? That's a topic discussion, especially for U.S. to maintain the strategic ambiguity. With that, could that avoid the contingency in advance? What would be the conditions for that, if you can touch upon that? And needless to say, what should Japan do? Well, in the earlier session, as Noah-san said, what U.S. should do and what Japan should do, they should not be identical. So what should Japan do? If you can also have a discussion on that point as well. So for this session, I'd like to ask Yan-san, Kato-san, Schneider-san, Hyo-san, and Sahashi-san in that order to make a comment. So Yan-san, please.
What should Japan do? I'm looking at the situation from the Taiwan perspective. In 1972, between Japan and Taiwan, back then, ROC and Japan cut off the official diplomatic relationship. And since then, there has never been official diplomatic ties. So in every incident, the attitude has been ambiguous. So, for example, in the case of security issues, it's untouchable. Japanese government shouldn't even try to approach this. So Taiwan people think that it's Japan is trying to feel out how mainland China would react. Isn't that dangerous? What would happen if Taiwan contingency occurs? If there would be a flood of refugees coming to Japan, how would Japan respond? You have to think about that. I saw in today's news, Japanese government will build a shelter in Okinawa. Maybe Taiwan contingency scenario is being seriously studied. Maybe that's a factor behind the plan, but U.S.-Taiwan has the Taiwan Relations Act, but there's nothing in between Taiwan and Japan. There is no governing law. So if Japan wants to help, even if Japan wants to help, there are Japanese expats in Taiwan. How can they evacuate? Will the self-defense force fighter planes come to have them evacuate? I think some kind of governing law should be established before contingency happens, but the Japanese government seems to be rather reluctant, and they're not in rush. I don't understand why they aren't in a rush. Are they scared about China? That's my question. Thank you for the frank opinion. And I would like to invite other panelists to comment on what Ms. Yan said. Mr. Kato.
So the question given by Mr. Kodama, there were 2 points. For U.S. to maintain the strategic ambiguity, is it possible to avoid the contingency in Taiwan? Another point is to avoid the contingency in Taiwan. Now, what should Japan do? 2 points. So let me try to respond to that. Now, for U.S. to maintain the strategic ambiguity, even if they do so, I think it is possible to avoid the contingency in Taiwan. There's a discussion that the role of strategic ambiguity is over, but there are 2 purposes for the strategic ambiguity. Is that without letting China know what we have in mind, but to have a deterrence for the Taiwanese invasion, because China will be scared to invade Taiwan if they can't predict what U.S. would do. And also for Taiwan not to go out of control. If U.S. Clearly says that they will defend Taiwan, they may be very aggressive and declare independence. So, but for the former purpose, not to disclose the way in China, but China is already assuming a U.S. military intervention and to be ready for that. So, for U.S. to maintain the strategic ambiguity, that meaning has weakened. However, if U.S. Clearly states that there will be a military intervention, what would happen? We don't know how China will respond to that. At least it is clear that there's going to be heightened tension. Now, for the second purpose of not letting Taiwan go out of control, looking at the political situation in Taiwan, I don't think there is no longer need for that. DPP administration is not saying that they will seek official independence. So there is no meaning to keep Taiwan go out of control. But there is a significance in not letting China know what U.S. would do. So what is happening right now is that Biden over 4 times said that the U.S. would defend Taiwan in his comments. So it's like, isn't it contradictory? But for U.S., I'm thinking that the U.S. is trying to have the strategic ambiguity even more ambiguous with the heightened tension. U.S. is trying to make a strategic ambiguity even more ambiguous, which could be meaningful. But for an ally in Japan, that kind of U.S. stance with being so ambiguous, we don't know how to respond. But U.S. stance to have a deterrence on China, I think it's quite effective. So what can Japan do at the time of contingency? So there is the framework such as the Security Treaty, Article 6, or as Ms. Yan said, so events of certifying the important event. But either way, it's all assuming that U.S. would have an action. So without U.S. taking an action, Japan cannot do anything under the existing frameworks. So Mrs. Snyder says that what Japan can do would be different from what the U.S. would do. But within the framework, Japan cannot do anything unless U.S. takes an action. So as long as U.S. maintains strategic ambiguity, the only choice Japan has is to also be ambiguous. So if Japan decides clearly that they'll go ahead and defend Taiwan, regardless of what U.S. would do, but we are not even capable of doing that. So what Mr. Taida said can only be taken. So what should we do in Japan? There are 2 points, military and non-military. So on the military front, to be ready for the U.S. military action, those 3 frameworks for Japan to support the U.S. forces. We need to strengthen the structure to support within the existing framework. Another important point is non-military. Right now, so-called hybrid threat. So to launch missiles, to launch bullets, that would not necessarily trigger the invasion to Taiwan, so-called the gray zone with the cyber attacks and disinformation, with all those means for Taiwan people to think that we don't know when U.S. will come. And with all these actions taken, we just have no choice but to give up and raise our hands. That's what China is aiming for. When I was in Taiwan, I was talking with different people, and one executive of DPP was that Taiwan's ATM, 80% of Taiwan's ATM, if they get stopped, then the young people in Taiwan would give up, would surrender. And with the blackout, if the smartphones cannot use and if the internet get disconnected, then a lot of people will not be able to get information and they would feel helpless if that happens. So what Japan should do is that to strengthen Taiwan. And Japan would not defend Taiwan, so we need to have Taiwan strengthen themselves. Because Taiwan falls, then Japan, for its national interest in economic and political, military and many factors, Japan would suffer damage if Taiwan falls down. So as long as Japan can defend Taiwan, as long as cannot defend Taiwan, we need to have Taiwan strengthen themselves. There are 3 points. One thing is that we have to keep on sending a message to Taiwan that we'll never leave you behind, to give them a sense of comfort and security. That is very important. Japanese people tend to forget, but Japan has abandoned Taiwan back in 1972. And Taiwanese people remember that. Japanese people have forgotten that. But when Japanese people visit Taiwan, and we think that Taiwan people are very much friendly, it's a great place, but that's not true. Well, we have abandoned that once. So we have to send the message saying that we will never do that. And also, we have to support to comprehensively strengthen the economic grounds to enhance the resilience and the whole society resilience for Taiwan. U.S. is doing that, and Japan needs to also provide support for that purpose. And the third point is that we need to raise the lead by vision without a military force, of course. So we need to show the vision for the region-wide strategic concept. That's all from me. Thank you for a very clear message. Now, moving on to Mr. Snyder, please.
So I think when we talk about deterrence, when one interviews academics, they'll often talk about a framework of deterrence, but also reassurance that in order to avoid essentially a spiral where one side is not sure whether the other is trying to deter them or to prepare for an attack on them, each side builds up militarily more and more. We need to have also dialogue and reassurance, and I think that's obviously true and is the primary responsibility of governments to make sure those dialogues are happening. But I think thinking about the situation from a journalist perspective, we in the media also have a responsibility to cover the reassurance piece of the picture with the same thoroughness that we do the military, the sort of hard deterrence piece of the picture. And I think that's something we perhaps sometimes fail to do adequately. It makes for much better headlines and certainly much more exciting copy to talk about military drills, to analyze the number of ships or missiles on one side's forces or another. But we ought to be and need to be sure that we are also keeping an eye on the quiet diplomacy that goes on around the region, on the deep economic and people-to-people ties that, despite all of these great power tensions, still exist, are still developing, and hopefully do provide some kind of buffer against the military tension. So I think from a media perspective, that's one thing we can and certainly should do. As an American citizen, if I may, in answering this question, I think often about George Kennan and his long telegram in which he laid out what became known as the containment doctrine vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And if you read that text, when he talks about prescriptions, what he talks most about is strengthening the health of Western societies themselves. Just to quote, if I may, briefly from it, he writes that in this contest, much depends on the health and vigor of our own society. Every courageous and incisive measure to solve internal problems of our own society, to improve self-confidence, discipline, morale, and community spirit of our own people is a diplomatic victory worth 1,000 diplomatic notes and joint communiques. Now, he's talking about Moscow and the Soviet Union, of course, but I think a similar principle applies to this moment and the relationship between America and China. The effectiveness of deterrence is not going to be measured only in the number of aircraft carriers or the number of missiles stationed in theater. Deterrence is also fundamentally a sort of question of perception and a question of psychology. And if the overarching perception of the leadership in Beijing or in Moscow is one of an America in chaos, of an America in decline, of an America unable to meet the obligations and responsibilities that it has taken on in an earlier era, that's perhaps the most damaging kind of perception. And so I think more energy and more effort ought to be going towards healing the fissures in our own society, and I think it will have great benefits not only for American society domestically, but for the effectiveness of deterrence here and in the Indo-Pacific.
Thank you. Especially for the role of media, not just deterrence, but as you pointed out, the reassurance and the importance of dialogue and the role of diplomacy needs to be more highlighted. The importance of that. And George Kennan's story is very impressive, especially for U.S. society. The soundness of U.S. society, the resilience is also important. I completely agree on your point. So, Ms. Hill, thank you for waiting from Taipei.
Thank you. Now, I would, to the question of what needs to be done, I would focus on some short-term urgent issues and then a couple of longer-term challenges. So in the short term, because this year is an election year, and I think for the democracies involved in this issue, the US, if that's doable at all, really needs to avoid being drawn into making inflammatory statements or US politicians because of domestic politics and adding to the tensions over Taiwan. When it comes to Taiwan, I think there's also one very challenging factor, and that is the incoming president, Lai Ching-te, needs to be very disciplined. I think the main risk here is that he is just a very different politician from the incumbent Tsai Ing-wen, and he has already during the campaign, despite his pledges to be prudent and to follow Tsai Ing-wen's lead, his different style of speaking has already led to a couple of situations where he made remarks that were then understood or interpreted as being provocative or adventurous on China. So he probably needs very, very good advisors, and then he needs to listen to them. I'm not sure that's a realistic assumption. Now, when it comes to China, what should China do? China obviously needs to take some of the posturing in democracies less seriously and maybe have a bit more of strategic patience. But these recommendations depend on what we think Xi Jinping's goal is. And if we watch how China has been dealing with Taiwan over the last few years, there's certainly an impression that China has been taking advantage of some of the things that have come from the Taiwan side or from the US side to engage in salami slicing, to make gradual adjustments to the status quo in its own favor. So China may want to continue doing that. So that's in the short term. In the longer term, the big challenge I see, and where I think both the US and Taiwan and the US allies need to step up their efforts, is deterrence. I think deterrence is falling short. The first reason is that the kind of risk Taiwan is under from China right now is less the prospect of a full-scale amphibious landing style of invasion, but a creeping pressure campaign that is underway, and that has already changed the status quo. And my perception is that there is nobody has developed any kind of concept for countering this gray zone style behavior with military elements. I mean, there is no valid or really effective deterrence going on against that. So that's probably one of the challenges. And then one of the areas where I think deterrence could be strengthened, or maybe this could be changed, would be preparing for a more serious situation or for a more acute crisis in a more credible way. So, for example, planning, even though we have discussed that Japan, or nobody might know how exactly or whether at all the different actors would get involved militarily, still you have to do planning. You have to create the conditions for being able to do so, for like different levels of involvement. For example, interoperability between the US and its allies, some kind of basic conditions for real-time exchange of intelligence information between the US and its allies and Taiwan, deconfliction for a situation where military aircraft from various countries could be flying, that kind of thing. So on Japan's side, for example, that is, I gather that there is now work being done on legislation on security clearance, which have been a hurdle to deepening these kinds of things between Japan and its allies. So that's one example. But if we look at Taiwan, Taiwan also needs to greatly step up its efforts on preparation. That's also why deterrence is falling short here, that Taiwan is not credibly preparing. From Taiwanese point of view, the situation has already greatly changed because they are engaging in some defense reforms. But from an outsider's point of view, that is still too little too late. So Taiwan also needs to greatly step up its efforts. And maybe one final point linking to what Noah said about strengthening Western democracies, this certainly is also an area where the US, Japan, and others can help Taiwan, because Taiwan itself, Taiwan's democracy, despite all the praise it is receiving all over the place, has a soft underbelly and many weaknesses, and so there should be more support and more encouragement for Taiwan to address things like corruption, cronyism, lack of media literacy, poor quality of media news content in general, and that would also help fight disinformation.
ありがとうございました。今お話を伺っててです。
Thank you very much. As I listen to you, I'm going to ask Professor Sahashi soon, but the substance of deterrence, this was mentioned by Mr. Kato and also by Ms. Hill. In other words, perception of military threat by China. Not only that, but creeping and pragmatic, realistic change that could occur should be grasped, captured, and we have to think about responding to them. And that is common to the definition of Taiwan contingency mentioned by Professor Sahashi. We should apply a broader interpretation. In other words, not just invasion, military invasion, but various political maneuvers by China may constitute that definition, as suggested by Professor Sahashi. That was my take. Sorry for having kept you waiting. Sahashi-san, please. Thank you very much. I would like to divide my comments into two parts. First, in order to prevent Taiwan contingency, what's necessary? One, U.S. and China to secure stability. And in order that to be secured, it's not just deterrence, but reassurance is necessary. How can we secure reassurance? Second, Taiwan or Taiwan Strait's stability. The countries that attach importance to deterrence of the straits should strengthen deterrence. So those are the 2 points. First, to establish stronger stability, it's not just deterrence, but reassurance is necessary between U.S. and China. But to what level do you offer reassurance? And what's the definition of reassurance? What is reassurance? Generally speaking, to supply reassurance, your intent must be correctly communicated to the other side. In other words, you want peace. You don't want to cause war. That should be very clearly articulated to the other side. And that would avoid undesirable situation for the other side being erupted. What's necessary? One is dialogue, and another important necessity is not to send the wrong signal. And from such perspective, I think that U.S. maintaining strategic ambiguity should be appreciated. And at this stage, publicly announcing that U.S. would review strategic ambiguity is unwise, because that may send the wrong message. In other words, U.S. isn't of the intention to cause war. So if U.S. sends a message that they will change strategic ambiguity, that would be counterproductive. So As such, including strategic ambiguity, how do we establish a framework of supplying reassurance? That's important. The problem is whether China will be willing to do that. At the same time, what about the U.S. side? If U.S. attaches too much weight on reassurance, that's also a problem. What am I talking about? Détente is ultimately what should be delivered through reassurance. Neil Harbison in Foreign Affairs talks about Kissinger, and at the beginning of his article, he defines détente. So please take a look. In other words, when tension elevates in order to coexist, to avoid war, détente is something that needs to happen. In other words, the United States sense of crisis regarding the Taiwan Straits, if that's elevated, it goes beyond the level of current discussion. In other words, not reviewing strategic ambiguity or not allowing speaker to visit Taiwan. That level, White House is already doing. If tension elevates further, it's like a Cuban crisis. Détente is the only choice. U.S. theoretically can jump to détente, cannot be denied, and they can justify that. In other words, they have this legitimate cause. In order to avoid a war between powers, they have to do that. That's a must. From our perspective, there's no situation that allows that to happen at this stage. But in the future, is there a possibility? We have to watch that very closely. But at any rate, to what level do you provide assurance? That's the key. And when the next administration takes power, whether it be Republican, and if it not Trump, even if Biden administration continues, when Taiwan crisis elevates, then dialogue with China becomes important. And then China may require détente type of response. 2017 may recall that. What were they talking? You might have forgotten. Secretary Tillerson of State. Maybe the fourth U.S.-China agreement can happen. That's détente. Is it necessary right now? No, but we have to think about that. To what level do you provide assurance? And I think just the right level is what we need to do. There's détente only and no assurance is not an option. So to what level do you raise reassurance? I think that's important. So I'm running out of time, so I'll be short. Japan included, people who want stability in Taiwan Straits. How can we strengthen deterrence? Because as Ms. Hill mentioned, creeping. So we have to raise deterrence. And Ms. Yan talked about Japan and Taiwan, but at the moment, I don't think it's necessary at this stage. And I'm trying to provide a counter comment to your comment, because Japan already has a legal basis if we want to take action, so it's unnecessary. But what can be done should be done. And in order for that to happen more concretely, Japan and Taiwan authorities should have direct a place of talk, if not indirect. And for that to happen, Taiwan's true strength should be elevated, as Mr. Kato mentioned. And this was also mentioned by Mr. Kato, but what's important is morale. Same applies to Ukraine. To what level do the actual parties have the will to do? That's very important. And in order to secure their own will of the actors themselves, we have to confirm that. But regarding fake information, Taiwan's research is far more advanced, and we can learn much from Taiwan researchers. That's my frank impression recently. But research cooperation can be done, so academia should do that in order to strengthen research cooperation. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have an additional question to you, Professor Sahashi. It's related to what you said. You said Japan changing Taiwan policy or Japan conspiring with the West. We should rectify such image. I think that was what you said. That versus Japan, GDP 2% defense budget, that's the target in 4 years' time. That versus what you said. Is there that consistent? How would China perceive? Regarding defense capability of China, Japan is not just doing for the sake of China. It's the general security policy, so that's okay. That's one way of putting it. And most likely, in our relationship with China, of course, assuming Taiwan and North Korea, we have to upgrade our defense capability. But I don't think it's wise to connect that directly to Taiwan contingency in public because it's unnecessary to make such comments in public. So that kind of consideration, there's a traditional art craft and Asian policy. We have a tradition of such capability. We've been doing that traditionally. U.S. wants to do that, but because of the noise in Congress, the U.S. administration has been disabled to do that. But we upgrade our capabilities. We upgrade our capabilities, but we don't need to be provocative. And Taiwan doesn't want us to be provocative. What's most important is substantively to what level do we upgrade. The U.S.-Taiwan, Japan-Taiwan relationship have historically been quite symbolic, but I think we should place our access on substance.
ご質問ですが、
Question to Ms. Yan. This is something related to a point raised by Ms. Hill. With the incoming President Lai, he is not a technocrat, he is a politician, so he would be quite different from Ms. Tsai. Then a message to China, in order to, they need to be able to manage the message to China. For that purpose, he would have to have a very talented advisor to be able to have a well-versed view with how China is responding and how U.S. is responding. And they have to make sure to put the right wording to send out the accurate message. So that was a point made by Ms. Hill. So what is your view on that, Ms. Yan? I completely agree with that. So the advisors, the brain, the policies, and the way of thinking of the advisors will be very important. Among the Japanese academia, Professor Matsuda from University of Tokyo also said that from China, under the surface, with Mr. Lai in Taiwan, they may be exploring something under the surface. Actually, in 1996, at the time of the crisis of Taiwan Strait, back then it was under the leadership of Mr. Lee. There were people with mission being involved in some work under the surface. We found out that later. So under the surface, underwater, there have been people from both sides having a dialogue in Hong Kong. So that didn't happen. So President Xi Jinping going forward, if he'll be more confident, then with Taiwan, it might be better for him to have some kind of dialogue with Taiwan. Of course, Lai Ching-te himself putting down his will of independence of Taiwan. But I think he will work for the interest for Taiwan. Anything to be added by Ms. Hill, please?
Oh, sorry, I was a bit slow to unmute myself.
いえ、この、
No, not a problem. You were listening to Ms. Yang. You mentioned President Lai needs a good advisor. If you have anything to add, please go ahead.
Well, I'm certainly not going to give any names. What I basically meant by focusing on him was that he has shown in the past that he's sometimes he can't resist commenting on some issues that Tsai Ing-wen has resisted commenting on. For example, there's of course there are all these ambiguities around Taiwan's status of statehood and Taiwan's national identity. And when talking about the Republic of China Constitution, for example, Taiwan has been very prudent, very careful, and even when pushed, she has resisted trying to clarify those, and she has stuck to that ambiguity, whereas during the campaign, Mr. Lai has not, and that has not really worked well. So it would be, I think for him, it would be helpful to kind of be even more cautious.
ありがとうございました。それではですね。
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we're going on to the question and answer session. And we have received 2 questions in advance. So let me read those questions and ask you to answer. And those of you who are online, please type in your questions to the Q&A box. The first question. Tonedachi-san of Japan Center for Economic Research. Tonedachi Hisao-san, let me read the question. We are concerned about the response by Japanese when contingency occurs. Is there a gap between Japanese awareness perception versus U.S. and Taiwanese expectations? What do you think? Mr. Kato, please go ahead. Thank you. According to polls, based upon poll results, let me answer that question. To begin with, when we look at polls taken in Taiwan, if tomorrow China starts a war against Taiwan, which will win? That question was asked. 51.2% said China, 29.6% answered Taiwan. So that was 2022, 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago. They think they can't attain victory. That's the major presumption. So we have to help, or else they will surrender. Simply put, you look at Ukraine. Looking at Ukraine, maybe the perception has changed quite a bit in Taiwan, so we can't be too simplistic. But that's what the poll says. So that's the presumption. Then what about CCP exercising force? Will U.S. send forces to protect Taiwan, defend Taiwan? 42.8% said they think so, and 46.5% said they don't think U.S. would come to help. So more said no, U.S. won't come. On the other hand, expectation towards Japanese military intervention. Will Japan send troops? 58% said yes. Japan will send troops. So I said misinterpretation or wrong expectation, but this is the clear wrong expectations that reflected in the poll results. So they expect more from Japan than from the United States, and that's reflected in poll results. And if we look specifically at what they expect from Japan, if China invades Taiwan, including defense equipment, various aid will be supplied to Japan. Do you think so? Yes, 60% answered yes, and no, 31%, so half of those who responded yes. In other words, 60% of the respondents said that including defense equipment, Japan will come to aid. Even if the self-defense force doesn't come, Japan will give us weapons. Like Ukraine is getting from NATO and the Western countries. Now, separate from whether that's correct or not, that's what they think, the Taiwan people think. Then what about the general public in Japan? Taiwan contingency, SDF with U.S. forces. Will they fight against the PLA? 74.2%. No. No, they don't want to see that. They object. So there's this huge gap between Taiwan's expectation versus Japanese general public.
Thank you, Mr. Kato. Let us move on to the second question. For a specific theme, it's not on the specific theme of contingency in Taiwan, but there's a question from Ms. Yayoi Watanabe of Panasonic Operation Excellence. Let me read them out. It is very difficult for the companies to answer questions on matters that involve political risks, but media often ask those questions. how do you think the media perceives the inability of companies to respond to those type of questions? And what do you expect from the company's answers? So, Mr. Snyder, if you can respond to that first.
It's a fascinating question. The question could be read in several ways. When we talk about it being difficult for companies to answer questions regarding political risk, I guess I wonder whether it's difficult because they don't want to heighten the political risk, which is to say that they don't want to say something that would cause further risks, or whether it's difficult because they actually don't have an answer to the question about what to do with political risk. And I think if it's the former, there are ways to communicate to journalists that you do have plans, that you are thinking through these issues without being provocative, whether that's background briefings, off-record conversations, ways of communicating information short of loud press releases. But if it's the second, if it's the latter, namely that questions about political risk, companies don't have good answers to what they would do in these situations, then I think the answer is quite the same as what we've been talking about with governments, which is that everyone needs to be planning more and thinking more about possibilities that hopefully won't happen, but may happen.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you, Ms. Hill or Ms. Yang. Anything to add? Please go ahead. Oh, Ms. Yang. This is Yang speaking. As Mr. Kato said, what should Japan do? One of the things Japan should do is to make Taiwan stronger. I'm thinking about the position of Taiwan in international society. We can't accede to WHO, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization. We can't accede to ICAO because of obstruction by China. And this is a civil aeronautic safety issue for Japan as well. If Japan can influence the international community on such issues, then that would encourage Taiwan. And CPTPP, accession by Taiwan. If Japan can support our bid, then that would be appreciated. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, we are really running out of time. So Q&A session will have to close here. Now, we have only about 10 minutes, so we will begin our closing session. Again, to each and every panelist, thank you very much. This is a very complicated theme. You spoke from various dimensions in 1 minute or so. Again, as closing comments, final words that you want to communicate to the audience. And at the very end, I will try to close the session. But before that, I ask the panelists. And Ms. Yang, once again, please go ahead. On Taiwan contingency, we were able to discuss on this matter. So I'm really happy that this opportunity was given to me. I'm happy, but I'm rather concerned. I'm sad as well. Japan won't come to our help? That's sad. And Japan-Taiwan relationship, Japan doesn't need to have a Taiwan Relations Act, and it's better without such an act. Professor Sahashi said we would be better off without such an act. Japan and Taiwan, from the Taiwanese perspective, we were like brothers and sisters. We are part of the same family. People of Taiwan think so. So Taiwan contingency is a Japan contingency and is a contingency for the U.S.-Japan alliance. That's what late Prime Minister Abe said. And after he said that, all the Taiwan people quote him. So that's how the expectations are towards Japan. Of course, if possible, Taiwan wants to make positive contribution to the Japanese society. We would do anything to help Japan. So Japan and also the United States, I hope that you can be more interested in Taiwan issues. Thank you very much. Ms. Hill, thank you for connecting in from Taipei.
Thank you. I have two final very brief comments. I get the impression that probably there is still a need for us to report more on how exactly the Taiwanese see the situation and what the nature of Taiwanese expectations or perceptions is. So on the one hand, one example I think is the question of whether or not Japan would or should come to the rescue in case of a conflict. I'm not entirely convinced that these poll readings reflect the true nature of understanding on Taiwan's end of what role Japan could play. At least in terms of policymakers, there's a very clear understanding here that some of the changes Japan is undertaking in its defense posture and defense spending and some of the arms it is acquiring and deploying will have very real implications for Taiwan's security situation. One example being putting more of a focus on the southwesternmost islands of the Japanese archipelago. So national security officials in Taiwan are very aware that if you have anti-ship missiles on some of these islands, it of course does affect the situation for the Chinese Navy going out through something like the Miyako Strait. Taiwan knows that on the other side, on the south, there's now intensifying cooperation between the US and the Philippines, with more bases in the far north of the Philippines being accessible to US forces and possibly the deployment of similar such weapons. And that in turn, if that all were completed, then you have a very changed situation for the PLA, because it could not, without risk at wartime, exit those two straits to the Pacific and put its carrier, for example, right off eastern Taiwan. That in turn would give Taiwan's military a chance of still having some of the East as a somewhat protected place for operations. So that's one. And then in terms of the public, I think the perceptions and views on expectations of the Taiwanese public are much more complex than is reflected in some of the polls. I think people are some of what they sometimes express is more wishful thinking, and some of them know that. And I think it's more when they express that they think Japan would come to their help, it's a reflection of general very positive views towards Japan, and is maybe also in comparison of some of the doubts about the US.
ありがとうございました。はい、それ
Thank you, Mr. Kato.
はい、私はです2点だけ言います。
So 2 points from me. The first point is that, as I mentioned in my first session, for the peace and stability of Taiwan Strait, Japan together with US said that it's important, but we are responsible to make it the reality. China is actually challenging the message. It's not that we're going to want to have a fight with China over that, but as long as Japan said that, if that is broken off, then some action should be taken. By so doing, we need to enhance the credibility of such policies. So something has to be done. And my second point is that what kind of support should we provide Taiwan, including the time of contingency? It's not providing charity to Taiwan. It's not about giving charity to Taiwan, but from a Japanese national interest, what should Japan do? In other words, if Taiwan falls under China, what would happen to Japan? We have to think about that seriously. As a matter of fact, I'm doing a lot of research, but in Japan, there are almost no studies on that, and almost no studies in U.S. either. So Japan and U.S. are not necessarily giving a serious thoughts to that. So we have to do that. If we did that, then what should we do? I think the answers will follow naturally if we do more research. That's all from me.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Professor Sahashi.
ごめんなさい。スナイダーさんで、それから
Sorry, Mr. Snyder.
No, thank you very much. Just two brief points from me as well. I think the thing that stands out to me in this discussion is that we need to mind the gap. We've been talking and noting the many gaps, perception gaps, expectation gaps between different players, different actors, different agents in this region and around the Taiwan issue, and I think we in the media certainly have a responsibility to do our best to try and close some of those gaps, to make sure that these misperceptions or misexpectations are tempered with accurate reporting on the reality of what's going on in other parts of the region. The second point is just how complex and how many different perspectives need to be accounted for, and we've discussed many of them in today's session, but towards the end we've only now started to touch on, for example, the role of the Philippines or the role of the Southwest Islands and Okinawa in politics. I think there are plenty of nuances and nuances even within Japan. And I think I come away from this ever more aware of how many perspectives we ought to keep in mind and be reflecting in our coverage all the time.
野田さんありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Noah. Professor Sahashi, thank you very much. One thing that wasn't raised, that will be my closing comment. November this year, if Trump wins, very hypothetical. What if? May 20th, inaugural ceremony in Taiwan. By then, I think there will be more stability in the Straits. And even if there are hiccups, I think there would be more stability. That's my very arbitrary view of a researcher. But the first week in November, depending on the results of the presidential election, there could be a significant uncertainty. And there's two possibilities. What if Trump wins? What would happen? There are only two. And these are both extreme scenarios. One is very, very stringent and hard line against China and become positive to Taiwan. Very hawkish strongliners against China may be friendly to Taiwan. And Kato-san was mentioning this. When we lose Taiwan, what situation will emerge? China's military ambition would explode, emerge, and be unveiled. So they want to keep the cork screwed in. So this is the corkscrew theory. If those are those who will become responsible of Taiwan policy in the next Trump administration, or will they be American firsts? And if American firsts are really negative about Taiwan, they think that Taiwanese stole chip technology from China. From U.S. So this extreme, America firsters may move towards deal making with China. So if such an extreme thing would happen, that could happen after November this year. So we must not forget that. But until then, we think we should engage in different simulations. And finally, on Japan. In many different ways, Japan should discuss Taiwan issue. And it's good that we are seeing more reporting regarding Taiwan, but we need more. And we also need more journalists reporting Taiwan. And once again, I was reminded of those key points. Thank you for accepting me.
それではもう
Thank you, Professor Sahashi. We only have 2 more minutes, so as a concluding remark, I'll be brief. So in today's discussion, one common perspective among panelists. I think there are 4 points. One is to avoid the conflict. The most important thing is the deterrence and dialogue between U.S. and China. To have a stable relationship between U.S. and China, what should be done? We need to think about that. That's the first point. And within that framework, the role of Japan is for Japan to be ready for deterrence is one thing, but also the dialogue, for the dialogue to understand accurately what U.S. or China or Taiwan is doing and to provide a diplomatic support without any misunderstanding. And then the democracy in Taiwan and the importance of exercising democracy. With that in mind, we need to strengthen the non-political level to support the more resilience in Taiwan. And for Taiwan, we need to make sure to avoid the spread of the disinformation, not to provoke the amplification of the mutual distrust. So last but not least, once again, I'd like to show my gratitude to the audience viewing today's international webinar, and also I'd like to thank 5 panelists to have made it here despite your busy schedule. You gave us a very valuable and food for thought and a frame of reference today with us. And as Noah-san said, it's a very complex issue, but many different perspectives are there, and we need to review all those different perspectives. So one last thing, a request for you. After the webinar screen is finished, there is going to be a link to the questionnaire, so I ask your support to fill in the questionnaire. And last but not least, I'd like to also thank the interpreters for today's service. With that, the time has come. We'd like to close the second international webinar of FPCJ. Thank you for being with us. So this concludes the seminar. Thank you.
キャサリンさん、本当にどう
Catherine, thank you very much for being with us from Taipei.
Okay.